So, welcome to Chapter 2, The Nature and Extent of Crime. As we continue on with looking at criminal theories, we first have to continue to set the foundation before we can dive into what some theories are. So let's go ahead and jump right in, shall we? What are some of our primary sources of crime data? Because if we want to understand the theories associated with criminality, why criminals engage in the criminal offenses that they engage in, we do have to take a moment first and look at where we get our crime data and how we can track and analyze and understand crime data. So our primary sources of crime data are surveys and official records. Now, criminologists are going to use these techniques to measure the nature and extent of criminal behavior and the personality, attitudes, and the background of criminal offenders. If we can understand how this data is collected, what will happen is it will allow criminologists to tackle various problems within the field. Because the whole premise and purpose behind a criminologist is to understand why an individual engages in criminal activity, what has caused them to engage in criminal activity, and eventually look at some of the ways in addressing the criminal behavior. Again, a lot of this is tied to theory, but we do want to look at our official crime data as well. So we have this thing called the Uniform Crime Reports. And the Uniform Crime Reports are a database compiled by the FBI. So the FBI compiles this large database. Law enforcement agencies will submit data to the FBI, and they will submit the data to the FBI every year, right? And it will focus on arrests, and it will focus on other official contact that law enforcement has had with an individual, and then they send that to the FBI, and they'll put it together in this nice report called the Uniform Crime Report. It does break down Part 1 crimes. Your Part 1 crimes are your more serious crimes: robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, manslaughter, motor vehicle theft, arson, pretty much any felony, right? But we also have what's called the Part 2 crimes. And the Part 2 crimes can be drug offenses. Pretty much any drug offense is a Part 2 crime. Although we know there are drug offenses that are more serious than others. For example, having fentanyl, having, cocaine, meth, some of the more hard drugs. Sex crimes falls in this category as well, as in addition to vandalism. But we do run into some validity issues when it surrounds the UCR. For example, think about confidence in law enforcement. What are those law enforcement agencies that people aren't confident that they will do a good job? What are some of the most notable law enforcement agencies in our country that have a bad reputation? Maybe some law enforcement agencies in New York or in LA, maybe some in other large cities. What about insurance? Some people will have issues with calling the police if they've had a crime committed because they may not have insurance. You have to have car insurance to drive your car, right? But how many people are driving around out there in public with no car insurance? And then they hit somebody and they take off, or they have no insurance. When we think about reprisal, that's getting even. Sometimes people will say, I've been the victim of a crime, something's happened to me, so I want to get even with the individual who committed the crime. Not important enough, hey, my watch got stolen, this watch got stolen, and it's no big deal. I can get another watch. The object was stolen, it's not a big deal, And then, of course, dirty hands. Sometimes when people are doing their own dirt, they will not call the police. I like to joke with my class and say, have you ever heard of the drug dealer who calls the police and tells the police that he got robbed? Have you ever heard of the person who sells drugs and they're hustling and then somebody robbed them and they call the police? Yes, it happens sometimes, but oftentimes they don't want to, engage with law enforcement because they're doing illegal and dirty deeds themselves. So then we have this thing called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or the NIBRS. Essentially, this is a more comprehensive program compared to the UCR. And what it is that it requires local police agencies to give a brief account of each incident and arrests involving 49 specific offenses, including the incident, the victim, and the offender information. What the NIBRS does compared to the UCR is that it does give a greater emphasis on more offenses. As you see, I'm just going through a couple of them: white collar crime and, domestic and familial abuse, pornography, DUI. Not saying that those offenses aren't covered under the UCR. They are, but it's specific offenses, right? Now, as you see from this data, and it's an older data metric, as of 2019, so pre-pandemic, you only had about 43% of all law enforcement agencies participating in the NIBRS. In my intro class, I talk about how there's well over 17,000 law enforcement agencies, but yet there's probably about, if I had to do just a off the top of my head guess, 43% would probably be around 71, 72, maybe 7,300 law enforcement agencies that are participating in the NIBRS. So we do have a little bit of a problem there. Now, another key data metric source, or how we can get data, is by doing surveys, right? Surveys are when you're just going to ask people about their attitudes, beliefs, values, characteristics, and experiences with crime and victimization. So with a survey, I'm going to do a sample and I'm going to have a population. So if we think about a sample, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to get a large group of people. I'm in Atlanta, so I'm just going to go to whatever. I'm going to go to, Little Five Points, or I'm going to go to Edgewood, or one of the most notable historic neighborhoods, the Fourth Ward, or wherever. I'm going to a notable area in Atlanta, and I'm going to take the people in that area. Now, I might want to do a population, which means I may say, okay, well, I'm going to go on, Peachtree Boulevard, and I want to get only people who live on Peachtree Boulevard, right? Or I might want to get, people of a certain ethnicity. So I do want to narrow it down even further when I have my sample size. But a survey is great because you're asking people, usually anonymously, about what their attitudes, beliefs, and values are and on a particular topic. In this case, usually when it relates to a victimization. Now, one of the best surveys that exists within our criminal justice system, and especially criminologists like to look at, is what's called the National Crime Victimization Survey. What the NCVS is a comprehensive nationwide survey of victimization in the United States, and it's conducted annually by the U.S. Census Bureau of Justice and Statistics, or the BJS. This report comes out usually every September. So we have the report for 2020. I want to say last September was 2023's report, right? We will not get 2024's report until this September. So we still have about 4 months before we'll get the 2024 data. But it is a very, very great tool when looking at people reporting their own victimizations. The National Crime Victimization Survey has been in existence now for, President Lyndon B. Johnson started this back in, I believe, 1965 or so. But it was rebranded as the National Crime Panel into the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's a very useful tool in collecting information and data on households that have experienced a victimization. So what about the validity of the NCVS? Well, for example, sometimes people have over-reporting. They may misinterpret an event. Lost wallet could be reported as stolen when it was misplaced. Somebody misplaced electronic and they think somebody stole it, and only to find out it was misplaced. You also have the sampling errors. It doesn't represent the nation as a whole. The NCVS, folks, the NCVS will only take about 270,000 households. That's it. Do you know how many people that live in this country? There are millions and millions and millions of people that live in this country. So the fact that it's only taken about 30 to 270,000 households is not a large sample at all. Underreporting can also be an issue. Some people may be embarrassed, and they may even feel like if I tell what happened, how I was victimized, or how I may have been involved in something that caused me to get victimized, then I may get in trouble as well. And many people are very fearful of getting in trouble themselves. Now, one other useful tool besides the National Crime Victimization Survey is just a self-report survey. And with a self-report survey, how that's helpful is that it will allow the subject to reveal their own participation in delinquent or criminal acts. The self-report survey is very good, especially when you're looking at populations that may be involved in criminality. So when looking at a self-report survey, think about how if an individual is engaged in juvenile delinquency, or a person has been in the adult criminal justice system, they may engage in a self-report survey. It is helpful, even though they're anonymous, because now you're getting offenders, delinquents, criminals, being able to candidly talk about their criminal acts. Now, major validity issue is you can't expect people to candidly admit their illegal acts, because an individual who's in trouble with the law, and I'm formerly involved in law enforcement before becoming a professor, sometimes people don't want to admit things even when you give them the freedom of anonymity, because their fear is that they are going to be outed and they're going to be caught, and they don't want to be caught. In fact, I will talk about this in greater length in a couple of chapters regarding my quote-unquote 3 Ps, and also things that offenders really focus on. And one of those is they do not want to get caught. A good buddy of mine who works in law enforcement, I'll give him a shout out when I get to the lecture, he often talked about this. So when we look at crime data, we do have to evaluate the strengths. The strength of the UCR is that it's the standard unit of analysis for which most criminological research is based. Why is that, folks? Because it takes the data from police reports. If a crime is committed, I don't want to say 98% of the time, or I don't want to even say 90% of the time, but more often than not, someone is going to call the police. Then we have the National Crime Victimization Survey. It focuses on the unreported crime. That's the key that I always used to harp on in victimology. The National Crime Victimization Survey focuses on the unreported crime. What it does is it's going to give key characteristics of the victim, but it's only focused on the victim, whereas the UCR is really more focused on the offender. And then lastly, we have the self-report survey, which gives an opportunity for characteristics of offenders. They can talk about their attitudes, values, and beliefs. The beauty of the self-report survey is it's also focused on the offender, but it's allowing them the veil of anonymity to talk about things that they've done. Not so you can try to find out who they are, but at least they could talk about what they've done and the crimes they've committed. So a lot of great strengths with all 3 data metrics. With strengths comes weaknesses, right? For the UCR, we know nothing about the crime victim, right? Or if a person chooses not to call the police, we don't capture that data. So if you don't call the police, they don't know about it, okay? So that's the first thing. With the National Crime Victimization Survey, it asks you to estimate from a limited sample of the population. As I pointed out, if I'm in Atlanta and I go to Little Five Points, well, I'm neglecting the other major neighborhoods in Atlanta, right? Also, you have to rely on personal recollection. So how good is your memory? Did you remember what you did last week? Did you remember what you did 4 months ago? How good is your memory? And then with the self-report survey, you're asking criminal offenders, a group that is notorious for not being honest and not having a level of integrity, you're asking them to talk about their offenses and their crimes. You can't fully rely on their honesty, so to speak. So that's where the self-report survey comes into play. And again, I just want to show you here, just kind of, I'll leave this up for just a moment. so you can see what the Uniform Crime Report does, what it focuses on, what it captures, the strengths and weaknesses. The National Incident-Based Reporting System, again, gives a little bit more detailed information. The only problem is that you're only getting about 43% of law enforcement agencies participating. When we look at the National Crime Victimization Survey, we see that it's a large-scale national survey. It's going to capture information from crime victims. And then lastly, when we see the self-report survey, you're asking offenders to honestly and truthfully and openly participate in offering up their recollection on committing criminal offenses. So literally, yes, what you're asking them to do. So let's talk about crime trends, right? Let's shift gears as we look at crime trends. In terms of our contemporary crime trends, we know that crime rates are declining since they peaked in 1991. I wish I had the graph up, and I believe I showed this in class and in my classes that I've taught over the years, and certainly videos that I attach within the lectures. I don't put them in this per se because you have the ability to look up different videos on YouTube, and there's where I get my videos. But with that being said, what I would show, or what I would have attempted to show, is that crime rates have been declining, and before 1991 you saw a real just upward trajectory, and in 1991 it's like, wow. And I'm just, I was a kid in the 90s, so I'm telling you I'm a little bit older, but after that things started to go down. Okay, property crime has declined, and crime as a whole has been decreasing, but the public doesn't believe it. Why doesn't the public believe it? And this is one of the things that I love about in-person classes and lecturing in person, because we have a debate. I would ask my students, well, why do you think people don't, what is your opinion on why the public doesn't believe crime is going down compared to 1991? Well, for starters, many of you as my students, or if you're watching from around the world, depending on your age, you may not have even been born in 1991. You didn't come for at least another decade or two, or well, not two rather, but maybe like 10, 15, 12, 13 years, right? So, but you can talk to your parents about it, right? You can talk to your grandparents about what their recollection is on how things were in 1991. But the other thing is that people will say, no, violent crime is going up and murders are going up. And that is true. Violent crime and murders are absolutely increasing, even though crime in its totality has been declining since 1991. So we do have to pause, because we went through something. It's hard to believe, folks. It's hard to believe that just 5 years ago, even at this time, we were living in arguably the most existential crisis of a generation. We had no one really, unless there was some people that was around back during, I can't remember if it was the Spanish flu of 1919 or something like that, but I know there was some other pandemic that really caused widespread panic, and it made people say every 100 years we go through a pandemic, so we don't have to worry about another one until the year 2120. We'll have a whole brand new generation. Our current generation won't necessarily be here, but COVID-19 ended up reversing this downward trend in the decades-long crime rate decline, because what happened was you saw gun violence spiking in 2020, which was more than any other year in the past 20 years, right? And we look at how suicides, a person taking their own life, was also spiking, 24,000 people. I think there was a lot of widespread fear, and I think a lot of people were really concerned and afraid. And you see this coronavirus on the left side of my screen. I think a lot of people did not know what was going to happen. And so you had people who resorted to violence because they didn't know how to emotionally regulate. And you also had people who decided that they would take their own life as well. So if we look at the ecology of crime, First of all, think about the place and time. Where do crimes mostly occur? We see crimes primarily in, major areas, more populated areas, more densely populated areas. We also see crime occurring at certain times. For example, that 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. window is some of the most noteworthy and notable times of crime being committed, particularly because people are starting to get up and go to work. Houses are unguarded. We will talk about all of this in the coming chapters when we start diving into theory, and especially when we get to social structure theory. Again, I love when we get into theories because I know a lot of people aren't too fun and too happy about talking about theories, but I really thoroughly enjoy getting into theories. We also have to look at the season and climate. Most reported crimes occur during summer months. Why is that? People are on vacation. Right now, Memorial Day officially kicks off the summer season. Now, if you're a movie buff like me, which, by the way, look, you can see my Jumanji poster and my SpongeBob poster, and I have a lot of different posters around in my theater room, right? But if you're a movie buff like me, the official start of summer is the first weekend of May when that summer blockbuster movie comes out, whatever that is. I'm not wearing a Marvel shirt, but I'm a big Marvel fan, okay? And so Marvel has pretty much dominated the start of summer for the last almost 15, 16, 17 years, right? With that being said, understand that people are going on vacation. Kids are getting out of school. School in the South has pretty much ended, or in other places is about to wrap up within the next week. In the North, where I grew up, schools will be getting out at the end of June, and then everybody's going to be on vacation essentially from the end of June until pretty much the beginning of August. The Southern schools start back in the early part of August. The Northern schools start back after Labor Day. And then after that, it's back to a new school year, right? The summer months have the most crime because people are away from home. Houses are unguarded. People are on vacation, right? Weather also affects crime rates. When it's hotter, people are more apt and more likely to be away from home. And so they're more likely to commit crimes. Whereas when it's the winter months, where are people? In the house, right? They're not out and about. When we look at regional differences, large urban areas have higher rates of crime. I am in Atlanta, Metro Atlanta, but I'm in Atlanta. If you are in a place like Atlanta, Detroit, Philly, New York, Denver, other places, Seattle, name any major city in the United States, Memphis, they're going to have a higher crime rate. If you live in a smaller community, right, you're not going to have that high of a crime rate, correct? Gender in crime is important too. We know male arrests are higher than females. There's a lot of differences to explain that. We have trait differences and socialization differences and cognitive differences. When we talk about the cognitive differences, let's go there for a second, right? Females are found to be superior to boys in verbal ability. Boys are found to test higher in visual spatial performance. You know what that means? Females, you're very smart, okay? Your verbal intellect is off the charts. Males, we are visual. We have to see things. We have to visually look at something, right? And if we can visually look at it, then we can I get it. But females, generally speaking, you are superior in verbal ability. You can be given a fact or given a statistic or whatever and just memorize it. Men, we have to look at it. We got to draw it out. We got to write it out. And then we can, we can understand it. So again, arrest rates for males are generally higher than females. If you go to your jails, who do you see more in jail? You see more men in jail, right? Not saying females don't commit crime, but you see more men incarcerated. Very true trend. Race and crime, institutional bias. Listen, I know this is very controversial, and that's why I've always put in my lectures, and I've been lecturing now for several years. I do put in that if we can't talk about it in a classroom, how can we talk about it in the streets? I know race makes people uncomfortable. Look at me, I'm a black man, right? I am called the professor for the people. And part of what makes me unique is that I'm able to talk about topics in areas that may be controversial, and hopefully you find yourself in a position where you sit back and you say, I appreciate Professor Fields for being willing to talk about these topics. In fact, I've gotten that before in different evaluations, and I've had students who've praised me for talking about stuff that others don't want to talk about. We do sometimes have to talk about racial profiling as it relates to the criminal justice system, right? This whole racial threat hypothesis, the argument that as the black population or the minority population increases, then there's a perceived threat to the white population, and it results in a greater amount of social control in African Americans. Listen, if you go into criminology or you go into criminal justice field, you will see what's called, disproportionate minority contact, or DMC. You'll see that. You don't need me to tell you that. You will see it with your own eyes. And that's not saying that those individuals who are incarcerated are only incarcerated because of the color of their skin, but there are a number of factors that exist which causes this, again, disproportionate minority contact, or a greater number of minorities facing incarceration. And again, we don't even have time to go over that. A lot of that will come out in other classes, okay? But race and crime is something that does explain a pattern in trend in crime. What about firearms? So, according to the National Crime Victimization Survey, firearms are typically involved in more than 280,000 non-fatal victimizations each year. In fact, about 70% of murders involve a firearm. Now, listen, we're going to come back to this firearm issue when we get to Chapter 10, Interpersonal Violence. But the truth be told is there are a number of videos that you can watch. And certainly when I lecture on in-person classes in the past, in the future, and in present tense, we have a number of videos that I show in class which highlights this very issue. The fact that firearms, why are firearms so common? And I love this topic in class because it gets a lot of people talking. Even some of the shyest and most reserved students will raise their hand and say, Professor, here's my opinion. And in my class, all opinions are welcome. So while we may not be doing this in this YouTube online forum, so to speak, I want you to think about if you were sitting in one of my classes and I said, let's have this debate on firearms. What are some of the reasons why you think firearms are involved in 70% of all murders? I'm pretty sure we would have some really great discussion and some reasons why, especially depending on what state you're from or what state we're in at the time of the debate. Social class in crime, there's two types of crimes: the instrumental crimes, offenses designed to improve the financial or social position of the criminal. Think about an instrumental crime. Listen, times are hard, inflation's high. I was in the store yesterday, eggs are still, $5.69 for, I want to say either a dozen eggs or 18 count of eggs. Eggs are still high. We're still dealing with the same issues that we were dealing with before, right? Things have not come down. They're getting worse. An instrumental crime would simply be, I'm doing something to improve myself financially. So if I can go ahead and I can steal some money, or if I can go ahead and steal some objects or whatever, I'm just trying to improve myself. Expressive crimes are offenses committed not for profit or gain, but for rage, anger, and frustration. If you're mad at a CEO, like a certain someone out there who took out a CEO, I won't say the name, but you know the case. The person's name starts with an L. If you are someone who is frustrated with a CEO, a supervisor, a boss, whomever, and you take them out, then that's an expressive crime. You're not doing it to improve your financial or social position. You're just angry at them. So social class does play a key role. And of course, we know with unemployment, it's not the strongest association, but many will argue that when there's high unemployment, crime rates or high employment, crime rates fall because everyone has a job, everyone's happy. But then when there are periods of, low employment or high rates of unemployment, when people are out of work, then they're more apt and more likely to break the law because they don't have a way to make ends meet. Age in crime. I've talked about this a little bit in intro. I'm going to get into this more. This whole notion of, when people are younger, they're more apt and more likely to commit crime. Younger people are arrested at a disproportionate rate to their numbers. But when you get someone who is a little bit, older, they are, in their, maybe 30s, 40s, 50s. Of course, when you get to people and become senior citizens, they will more than likely age out. That's not to say you don't get the 60, 70-year-old committing crimes. Generally speaking, it's rare when you start seeing someone in that age range committing crimes, but it does happen, right? Typically we see people that are, under 40, certainly in their teens, 20s, 30s, still committing high rates of crime. But when you start getting up in age, a person is more apt to age out and not commit as many crimes. When we look at just chronic offenders and criminal careers, we're going to go over this again when we get to Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck's developmental criminology, right? Developmental theory, rather. We're going to get into this a little bit more. There's this whole belief of what causes chronicity or what causes a person to be a chronic offender, and that's the early onset. That view that repeat offenders begin their criminal careers at a very young age. Individuals that start off young. Think about the person that's 8 years old, 9 years old, 10, 11, 12, that are getting in trouble, right? And you're trying to give them intervention and you're trying to give them services, right? And it's not working, right? They will get services in the juvenile system. And we don't talk about juvenile justice in this course, but it's saved in other courses. But at some point, with that early onset, some intervention must be had to get them off the path they're going. And that's why we'll come back to, propensity, life course, and developmental theory that was created by Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck. We'll get into that in our very last chapter when it comes to theories. But there's high implications. And again, these are all saved for in-person classes. The mandatory sentences, the 3 strikes policies, the 1994 crime bill by President Bill Clinton, it still has a reverberating effect even today. That crime bill said, you get that 3rd strike, you're out. You were going to prison for a very lengthy period of time or even life. Even though these were get tough on crime bills, unfortunately, they were very controversial, and in minority communities, they wreaked total havoc. So we are at the conclusion of this lecture. I want to certainly thank you for listening and for tuning in once more. It's been a pleasure, being your professor. It's been a pleasure talking about topics that I'm hoping will educate you. As always, share with your friends, share with your family. If you have family members who grew up in the 90s like myself, have a conversation. Ask them, do you remember what crime was like in the 90s? They may or may not, but it's just invokes a great conversation and a topic of debate. But these are some of the key things we went over. Remember, in this chapter, which focuses on the nature and extent of crime, where do we get our crime data from, right? We get them from official police reports, the Uniform Crime Report. We can get them from the National Incident-Based Reporting System, again, capturing 49 key specific offenses. We can get them from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which reports the unreported crime, or which focuses on unreported crime. And then lastly, we can get them from self-report surveys, asking criminal offenders to talk about what they've done. So I want to thank you for tuning in. As always, I appreciate the support. Be sure to share, be sure to like, subscribe, but more importantly, just thank you for coming to my virtual classroom. Be safe, be blessed, and I'll see you next time. Take care.